So, this is a little part of the blur that I wrote at the museum, but I'm going to read it just to begin my talk. What is so great about typewriters? I'll tell you what's so great about typewriters. There's two things. First thing is, typewriters are pinging, dinging objects of fascination. The soundtrack of the 20th century is the clack, clack, clack of a billion Olivettis, Remingtons, and Royals pumping out love letters, hate mail, sermons, pornography, audacious screenplays, tedious novellas, quotidian shopping lists, and nagging office memos. So that's what happened. That was the revolution that happened in the 20th century. There's something else that I didn't mention here that is really great about typewriters. Typewriters had a massive impact on people. People who were had horrible jobs suddenly had more tolerable jobs. And I'm going to give you a good example of how typewriters impacted millions and millions of people around the world. And as an example, I'm going to use my parents. So you're thinking, who is this glamorous starlet in the platform shoes, smoking a cigarette, sitting on the toilet? Well, this is my mother, and her name was Martha Gordon. And she was born in 1918, the year when we got the vote. And she was born in rural Northern Ireland, semi-rural. And so she left school at 13. And keep in mind, this isn't my grandmother, this is my mother. She left school at 13, and she became a pork butcher.
Wow.
So, not became a pork butcher, she was sent to work for a pork butcher, so you can't imagine anything more foul than working in an abattoir when you're 13. So that was Northern Ireland, that was Ireland, very 19th century kind of world of rural struggle. And so she eventually left the pork butcher and worked in a grocery store in Belfast. And then the war broke out. And she joined the Air Force. She basically ran away from home because her family didn't want her to leave, because each person had a role to work in the house and clean and So she ran away with her friend Muriel, who joined the RAF, and she became an electrician. She went to the RAF and she said, I want to be an electrician. I don't know where she got this idea from. And they said, well, women can't do that. That's men in the RAF. And she said, oh no, I'm different. She was extremely confident, based on nothing. So in the RAF, she became an electrician. And then after the war, everyone was looking for a job. People had two of nothing. Post-war England was very, very poor. And she said, well, the only skill I have is I'm an electrician. So she couldn't get a job anywhere as an electrician because those jobs were going to returning men. So she was completely shit out of luck, basically. To put a fine point on it. This is my dad. My dad left school at 15 and joined the RAF. It was for him, it was more of a I'm running away thing. He was born in Cardiff, in Wales, and his family story is actually more kind of grim, is the word that springs to mind. So when he was quite young, his dad, so this is Terry Doonan, who was born 8 years after my mum. She was a cougar, but we'll get to that. So his dad was an astrologer, which sounds really glamorous, but it was more of a carny astrologer. So he used to do horoscopes for people who were in the colonies, because this is back then. So he found that if you people would pay you to do their horoscopes, but they had no way to recriminate with you. You couldn't they wouldn't come bang on the door and say, "Wait, you said I was going on a journey." So it was kind of a bit of a finagle doing these horoscopes. And then he suffered from depression, I assume, because he killed himself and he died horribly. It was in the local paper. My sister found this clipping about his death. He took poison, died in a ditch. It's just horrible.
Oh my God.
So my dad was about 8 or 9 at that point. And then his mother had been rural, think Tess of the D'Urbervilles, out with the haystacks. And she had gone into service as a maid in a house. And then she had become a cook. So his mother was a cook. She'd gone from, the rural life to being in service, think like upstairs, downstairs, she's downstairs. And she suffered from mental illness too, very severe. She was schizophrenic. She had lobotomy.
Wow.
At this point, he was like, I'm running away. He ran away essentially to join the RAF. So it's a really, terrifying story on both sides. So they're both in the RAF. The war ends, and they both, as people who kind of ran away from home. Oh yeah, my dad spent like months and months and months on a troop ship coming back from, he was in Ceylon for the whole of the war, dropping bombs on troop ships. He was still a teenager basically, early 20s. He was a navigator on Wellington bombers, dropping bombs on warships. Age 18, 19, 20, by then he was doing that. So he, him and my mum, they don't know each other yet, and they go to this soup kitchen, to get some food. And they meet in a soup kitchen. And so that's them. They've met in the soup kitchen. And I said to my dad, well, what attracted you about her? And he said she had incredible legs. And she wore seamed stockings and tomato red, this is his actual words, tomato red suede platform shoes. And this is, like I asked, he told me this in his 80s, so obviously these shoes made a big impression. And my mum, you would never know where she came from. She was completely self-invented, and her favorite movie stars were like Hedy Lamarr and Lana Turner. So that's where she got it all from. And my sister and I never saw her without maquillage and the whole bit. She held her look was very important to her. So, and then I said to her one day, what was it like when you met him in the soup kitchen? Because he's riding a motorbike, he's drinking a lot, he's a young guy who smokes through a cigarette holder, what was it like? And she said, so what the hell are you going to do with your life? The war's over, we've got nothing, we're poor as dirt, no skills, no nothing. What are you going to do with your life? And he said, I'm going to wear dove grey spats and eat lotuses. And so there you see that my parents did have a camp sensibility, but weirdly it was kind of innate. So they, here they are, and they're on their way. One of them, I don't know who it was, had the idea that we'll learn to type, right? So we'll learn to type, not let's go back and I can work at the pork butcher or the grocery store I worked, or you can, go back and see what you can figure out in Cardiff. No, we're going to go into the future. We're going to learn to type and learn shorthand. So they went to Greg's shorthand school. And these, my sister still has these. So if you're learning shorthand back then and you're wanting to be a sassy secretary or an unsassy secretary. So you can't just show up with a bit of paper and start doing shorthand on it. You need a pad. So of course, after the war, there was no pads. There was no nifty Hermes pad covers. So they stitched these themselves out of an old bit of chamois leather that was used to clean windows. They stitched these, and my mother's like Elizabeth Doonan, that's her name, and that she dropped the Martha. She thought Martha was a very frumpy name. And when Jonathan and I adopted a dog, the dog's shelter name was Martha. And I said, well, that has to go. And we didn't want to call it Betty, because naming a dog after your mother is a bit weird. So we went with Foxy Lady. But that's another story. That's Elizabeth Doonan, and she had, even though she left school so young, all they did was teach them copperplate handwriting. So she wrote, every letter I ever got from her was this incredibly camp handwriting. So that's hers. And then my dad is Terence Sidney Doonan, so it's TSD. And these things I think are really kind of gorgeous because they made them themselves, they stitched them themselves. Talk about improvisational chic. Like they figured it out. So then they both learned, they met in the soup kitchen, they got married 2 months later, they got really drunk, they went to the pub next door with their friends, they lost the wedding certificate, so they never celebrated wedding anniversaries because they thought it was hilarious, because they couldn't remember when they got married, roughly when it was. So they had no sense, because they'd had such bizarrely Dickensian upbringing. They had no sense of occasion, no sort of weird, hyped up sentimentality. They just thought it was hilarious. We don't remember when we got married. And my mum used to say, that's so great because we don't have to buy each other twee gifts or anything like that, anything so bourgeois. So this is my dad, and he was cute, very handsome. And he is sitting in the 2-roomed garret where I was born in this house in Reading. And why had they gone to live in Reading? Reading's about less than an hour outside of London. So he's sitting there and he's trying to learn Latin because somebody at Reading University, they said, oh, we'll take servicemen, but you have to know Latin. Back then, you couldn't go to university if you didn't know Latin. It was a weird, not just Oxford and Cambridge, everywhere. So they had this strategy. I'll learn Latin and look after the kids, me and my sister, in the 2-roomed garret with no kitchen and bathroom, and you go out and work. So my mum could go out and type, do any number of typing jobs. So she was a temp a lot of the time, and the thing that sticks in my mind most about that period, and I remember this because it was still going on when I was quite young, she was working for these deposed Russian royalty, because Reading was full of refugees, Holocaust survivors, Poles. In our house that we lived in, there were Polish refugees, Russians. So there were these deposed Russians from the revolution, after around about the time of the First World War. And they didn't know how to do anything because they'd had everything done for them. So they trained dogs. They trained guide dogs. So my mom worked for this couple who were completely out of their minds, these Russian people. They walked around nude in front of people. They didn't have any normal, they were very unconventional because they'd had that royal, the woman I used to tell us, I'd wash my hair in 24 eggs every morning. No wonder there was a revolution, blah, blah, blah. And so they trained seeing eye dogs, and my mom did a temp for them for a number of years. And they had another woman who was working there who was this blind woman, blind since birth, called Phyllis. And my mom and her got on really well. They would just yuck it up and laugh about these Russians who had a pet monkey who would swing through the room and poop on them. And, so my mum and Phyllis became very close. And one day my mum brought Phyllis home. And she said she doesn't know where to live. She's going to live with us. And by that point, my grandmother, who'd had the lobotomy, had come out of the hospital, and she had a little bit of cash and bought this broken down house, and we all moved in there. So, and Phyllis moved in there too. So, and my Uncle Ken, who was also schizophrenic, we all piled into this
rooming house. And Phyllis lived on the top floor, and my mum said, there's no windows, but she's blind, she can't see. So Phyllis was up in the attic, and I mentioned Phyllis because she stayed for years and years with us, and we called her Auntie Phyllis. And she was this unstoppable blind woman who every day got up, get dressed, fed the dog, went off to her job, typing. And my sister and I were like, wait, what the actual? This is so weird. She's typing and she's blind, but of course, touch typing. So, typing was a great career for people who couldn't see. So our house was filled with typing. My mum by then had a Remington, an old one that she got at home, and she would do make extra money by addressing envelopes and stuff like that. In addition to she always had like 3 jobs, and she looked great. But we never saw her till all the drag was on, and then she'd go off to work on her bicycle. She was really like tough. The Great Generation, that's what they were called. So Terry's here frantically trying to learn Latin and get into stupid Reading University, which should have let him in anyway. And at some point, they said to him, we don't care even if you've learned Latin, you can't come in. So he had to get a job. We were getting older, so they came up with this bizarre idea for childcare. This has nothing to do with typewriters, but I'll tell you anyway. They put us in the local orphanage every day. So my sister and I were plonked in this orphanage, and it was so horrible. We still talk about it and laugh and cry and the orphanage. So, but that was, everyone had to do what they could to survive while they both went out to work. And my dad, this is a very interesting from a class point of view. So he went into the RAF, a working class boy, and then he's there mingling with all these chaps from various other social strata. And he became that, he started reading the Times, austere newspaper with no pictures in it, smoking a pipe, blah, blah, blah. So he presented really well, and he got a job at the BBC. So that's him later in his career, probably the 80s. So he typed all day long, but what did he type? So he scored this job at the BBC in the news department. And near Reading, there's this huge, beautiful old house that's a stately home, actually, but the BBC uses it to compile their news document. And my dad got a job there, talked his way into a job. So what he was doing all day while my mum was in all her various typing jobs was he was a Russian monitor, not because of the people my mum was working for, but just serendipitously. He sat there at a typewriter all day and with headphones on, typing down Russian propaganda, which was broadcast during the Cold War through the 50s, 60s, 70s, broadcast in English, as good propaganda is broadcast in the language it's supposed to be received. So he sat there typing away what they were saying about everything. He rarely talked about it, so I think he had to sign the Official Secrets Act, and it was all, very hush-hush, sort of. But anyway, that's what he did. And so what happened with my parents was typewriters, because they learned to type, because typewriters existed, because typewriters had become the revolution of the workplace, it got them out of jobs that were basically drudgery. And when people talk about typing pools, my mum worked in a typing pool at the BBC. She ran the typing pool. Then she became a union rep. She was perfectly cut out for that. Being a union boss for typists in the typing pool, blowing the whistle if it was too cold, the girls weren't being treated right, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And so yes, if she hadn't had that, she would have been probably back to Northern Ireland and, trying to pull a living out of somewhere, back to the grocery store or whatever. So yes, typists, they're a good example of how typewriters, and obviously it's not just them, it's that millions of people around the globe are going, and you hear people say, oh, well, typewriters just gave us more drudgery. You see those Orwellian pictures of typing pools with men or women sitting there, and you think, oh, horrible drudgery. But it was so preferable to the alternative, which was very difficult, dangerous work, factory work, repetitive work, blah-de-blah-de-blah. And so yes, typing. Typewriters changed the landscape in a really good way, I think. So for me, I think, thank God for typewriters, because it was such, growing up with them and seeing visibly how it sort of elevated their status in life and gave them a life that was interesting and stimulating. Drudgery, yes, sometimes, of course, but then infinitely preferable to what the alternatives were. So, yes, Betty and Terry. So, how long was that? 20 minutes?
Yeah, it was about half an hour.
Oh, so
Yeah, time for Q&A for sure. Usually we come around in the night, but I think I'll just come down a minute. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then I'll just point to you when it's your turn.
How jealous were the real orphans of you being able to leave them and come back every day? Is that where the distrust happened, or that's so?
how jealous were the real orphans? Well, what I remember of this orphanage was it was a lot of war orphans, and there was a lot of kids with Down syndrome. It was pretty rough, and we all used to play together. Kids are kids, and we were sort of always nervous that we'd be stuck there and nobody would come at the end of the day, which never happened, of course. Were the orphans jealous? I would imagine so. That we got to be picked up and they were stuck there. I mean, it's just, I have pictures of it somewhere.
You were how old to how old?
Like I would say 3, 4, something like that, 3, 4, 5. I have pictures of us there and we're toddlers. But it was sort of necessary childcare, and that was life. Everybody, post-war England was sort of rough for a lot of people.
Well, your history is absolutely stunning. Not in a positive way entirely, but it's astonishing.
It shocks me when I think about it. And when I tell people, they just look at me in disbelief, like I'm inventing some Dickensian backstory to try and seem more interesting. But yeah, no, that my parents they'd gone through a big leap. I went through a big leap in terms of where you come from, where you end up. But that seems to be their parents had too,
Were you inspired to go on to do all the ambitious things that you accomplished, partly because of watching your parents and their stiff upper lips?
Yeah, like never complain, never explain. That was very how my parents were. So, yeah, they were sort of had this weird. They were confident misfits, And I always think there were a lot of confident misfits that the stakes were so low that people weren't so anxious or insecure. They were just like, hey, why not? Give it a whirl. So they were confident misfits, and I think I was a confident misfit too. I just thought, what the hell, give it a whirl. And then at a very young age, I discovered fashion, because my mom always had fashion magazines, so I was like, oh my God, this is great. And I could see shimmering on the horizon was, the metropolis with gorgeous, sophisticated, cosmopolitan people were having fun and dressing up, and I had my eye on that from a very early age. I don't ever remember not thinking about the images that I was looking at in magazines. So that sort of, that was very motivating. I want to go over there,
Was there a version of FIT or something like that in London that you studied at, or did you just jump in?
I think I was too out of it and, disorganized to have that kind of focused thought. But I do remember one time my dad saying to me, oh, maybe you should get a job in fashion. Because, sometimes we'd be up in our garret, up where Auntie Phyllis was, looking out the window, and from this top floor window, you could see the biscuit factory, Huntley and Palmer's. That biscuit factory was in, and right next door was the jail, Reading Jail. And my dad, because I was getting a bit flamboyant, and I remember him saying, yeah, that's Reading Jail, where Oscar Wilde was imprisoned in Reading Jail, and wrote about it. And those people, back then people called gay people Jessies. Oh, he's a Jessie. So those Jessies, they have terrible lives. He was trying to dissuade me, I'm sure. They get blackmailed, they get beaten up, they get thrown in prison. Like, oh no, it's just an awful life. Anyway, that's where he was, like, dropping hints. So yeah, it was...
Biscuits for jail.
Yeah. Well, my mom actually, when we moved to Reading, she went for a job at the biscuit factory because, she said, I can type. And they said, well, we can put you on the packing line at the biscuit factory, but we have to pay you less because you're Irish. And which was very common back then. There were signs outside pubs that says no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, like outside pubs. In fact, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols, when he wrote his autobiography, he called it No Blacks, No Irish, No Dogs, because that was what it was a tough world. Makes you appreciate it. Maybe now things aren't so terrible,
We have another few questions.
Your sister take a creative path as well?
She is very creative, but she didn't. She was much more of an activist, much more of a 60s counterculture person. She used to listen to Joan Baez and Buffy St. Marie, and then she became one of the Greenham Common Girls, which was this activism that was sort of historic in England, maybe not so much here, where these lesbians all went to Greenham Common and they surrounded it, and Greenham Common was the site of the Pershing missiles. So when Margaret Thatcher and Reagan were trying to bring down the wall, and they were going to bring the Pershing missiles to England and point them at the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of ambivalence about that. Catherine Hamnett did that shirt saying 80% don't want Pershing. And my sister was part of this group of gay women who went to Greenham Common, lived there for an extended period of time, surrounded it. And I remember my mum, there's a picture somewhere of my mum visiting them at Greenham Common. So there were all these activist lesbians in anoraks and trying to stay warm, and my mom's all done up and smoking a cigarette and chatting with them. It's quite hilarious, sitting on a little camp stool with her nylons on, So my sister, she's very involved in climate change stuff in South London, and she always thinks of me, I think, as being a bit superficial and fluffy, because she's always was very much an activist. That was always who she was.
Can you talk a bit? I have all your books, and I am curious about the new one, and I was wondering if this is the time that you can talk about what you've just written.
Oh, my latest book. I'd love to. So it's called The Camp 100, Fabulous Flamboyance from Louis XIV to Lil Nas X. And the clue is in the title, the subtitle, that it was my attempt to sort of have an updated view of camp and think about why it was relevant today, why young people might be interested in it as a concept. So, but it's a playful book. So there's 100 camp icons with an illustration done by a guy in Brazil. Who has the Japanese name? It's in the book, anyway. So yes, that's what it is, and I make a big effort to distinguish between camp and campy, because I think when people get confused about camp and they disagree about who's camp, what's camp, it's more of a conflation of camp and campy. And I'll give you a good example. Camp with a capital C is John Wayne westerns, conventional western movies. Camp B is Blazing Saddles, which was a kind of knowing, in on the joke, intentional piss take of westerns and making fun of all the tropes of it. So camp and campy. And it's a very slippery subject, though. I think when the Met did their exhibit, a lot of people were like, wait, what? Because it's... But the best thing to do, the most fun read is Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. Well, of course, the second most fun read is Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. I thoroughly recommend it. You can get it on Amazon, just a tiny little version of it. It's good. Read one a day. You'll die laughing. I don't know if they were meant to be funny, but she puts a lot of wit in there. And she says funny things like, camp must always contain a note of failed seriousness. That's why monarchs and dictators are always camp, because they're very serious, holding their scepters and orbs, but we all just want to have a good laugh at them, so it has to have this element of failed seriousness.
Are dogs camp?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I thought about that, and I thought, you know what? Poodles are camp. So, yeah, poodles are camp. I don't think Labradoodles are camp. I think poodles are camp because they're sort of very serious, and their owners always say, they're hunting dogs, and they've had them cut in this really deranged haircut. No, they're hunting dogs. They're very serious, blah, blah, blah. And so I tried to include things like that. Cakes are extremely camp. Obviously, I've got stuff like the Real Housewives, Kardashians, Queen of England, Barbara Cartland, Liberace. They're all in that book. Then I have things like cakes that I don't think people have thought about. Because think about cakes. They're so ridiculous. They're of no nutritional value. And they're just like meant to engender all this sort of joy. And, there's something those French cakes, or like the one that's the campus is that one that's like a dome with green marzipan on the top. Yes, a princess cake. Very camp. Like
Carissa's cakes make camp?
hers are sort of rustic, aren't they? Maybe by the virtue of their extreme intentional rusticity, they might be willful rusticity. They might be camp.
May I ask how Barney's happened because it was brilliant when you were there?
Oh, how it happened. Oh, yes. How did I come to Barney's? So in 1985, I hit pay dirt. I got hired by Diana Vreeland to work at the Costume Institute, and I worked on Costumes of Royal India, which was a big show that she did in 1985. And that was when she said, pink is the navy blue of India, which is one of her famous sayings. So this was a real treat. It was about 6 months of preparation and then the installation. And then I thought, well, I'll just go back to LA and, resume my life. And at the opening, back then you could buy an after party ticket. It was $100, and you could go to the Temple of Dendur, and all the fun riff-raff models, people who didn't necessarily get invited or want to go to the dinner, which was a smaller affair back then. Maybe Pat Buckley, Paloma Picasso, were all there, and Nan Kempner. But then at the after party was just any person in New York who had $100 and the desire to go. So I'm at the after party. I went with Suzanne Barch. I don't know if you know her. And she was wearing, I remember, a Vivienne Westwood crinny. And we had such a great time. And I got introduced to Gene Pressman. And Gene Pressman was the son of the owner of Barney's, who back then was Fred Pressman. And we hit it off. And he said to me, oh, I know, you do those twisted windows at Maxfield in LA. And we were like, ha, ha, ha. And we both were talking about movies, I remember. And I said, oh, I love that movie, The Devils, Ken Russell's movie. It's so over the top. Oh, my God, that's my favorite movie. So we were having this bro bro down. And he said, well, you should come work for me because we're expanding our store. We're opening a big women's store. Andre Putman and Peter Marino are designing it. And I didn't know who they were. I knew who Andre Putman was, but he said, you should come work for me. So I'm very obedient. I went back to LA, sold my car, had a yard sale, and moved to New York and went to work at Barney's, which was, it's a good decision. It ended up being a very good decision because I was there involved for 35 years, saw it through all these things. It was an incredible learning experience. I was very lucky, and I'm forever grateful to the Pressman family for hiring me, especially Jean.
Yeah, I just wanted to know something about your approach to the design of the exhibit.
Oh, my approach to the design of the exhibit. Well, I think it was very visual. I think when Eric and I met at Tai Chi, pause for that to sink in, and he said to me, you used to do display, right? And I said, actually, women's wear regularly referred to me as the diminutive doyenne of display, so yes. And the minute I heard about it, I thought, great, this is going to be so fun. I've done some museum gallery stuff before. I worked on that show. I was the designer of that show, the Warhol look at the Whitney, which was Warhol in style, and that. I've done a few other, and the Freeland ones, but so I was like, great. I also designed the art gallery scene in Beverly Hills Cop, that with all that fake, silly art. So anyway, I thought, this is great. I totally get it. I see typewriters as being like objects of fascination. They're really crazy. And then Sherry sent me the pictures of the typewriters that Tom Hanks was going to send us. And it was just like, oh my God, mind blown. This is going to be so fun. And it was about making it fun, but having clarity. So you can see everything, but it's popping. Like you take a big Edwardian heavy typewriter, but let's put it on a fluorescent yellow pad so it pops. There's no reason why everything has to be sort of dour just because it's about typewriters. And to keep a playful element. And then Eric and I traded pictures of typewriter ads, and we were like, oh my God, look at this one, like back and forth with these typewriter ads. So those are a big part of it, to really add context to this revolutionary moment where typewriters took over the world, and they were competing, all these companies. And if you look at these Olivetti ads, they're the most beautiful ads you ever saw. And it's a very competitive field. So wanted to include the ads. Sherry had this idea to have an interactive element, which based on last night, my God, we should fill this whole area. Like, people were going crazy. How many people here had to go on the typewriter last night? Hello, forest of hands. So, yes. So, yeah, those are the elements. But wanted it to be colorful, playful, and then there's the rolling montage of video to take people into those, remind them of these contexts when Jane Fonda throws the typewriter through the window, Jack Nicholson's clackety-clack in The Shining. So yes, combining those elements to make it engaging and entertaining, because I love the fact that the church does shows about bicycles or boxing or things that resonate with people and then take you into them and make you think about them in a new way. And, setting up the show, definitely this week, I've thought about typewriters in a new way. I was always thinking about them in some way or other, but it really makes you see what an incredibly fertile field of design. And they're so intriguing because they're so complicated, but they're so stupidly simple. They're like this incredible paradox, ping, clack, ping. But they're looking into one is like looking into a brain or something. They're wonderful, wonderful objects, and I see why Tom Hanks is mesmerized by them. And we were thinking last night of what are some other things that that eccentric thespians might collect. And obviously vintage guitars and vintage cars, but If you have anyone have any thoughts? I know you collect toasters, don't you?
Yes,
How many?
I don't have 300.
Telephones, yes. That's actually a great idea. Oscillating metal fans. Oh. No, the gentleman I think had an idea for a collection.
Credit cards, because everyone destroys them.
Oh yeah, credit cards. Yes. Cameras. Sewing machines. Sewing machines, that would be very similar to typewriters. They're probably a lot of the same companies. And madam, you had a quick question. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Preparation for the exhibition, did you come across mechanical brides?
Mechanical.
Brides, it was an exhibition at the computer about the design of women's work.
Oh, that sounds great.
Posters and typewriters and the glamourization of women's work. The sauce designed Valentine.
Yes. Oh, was that in that exhibit?
There was that whole glamourization of women's work.
Yeah.
And so that exhibition had a lot of typewriters and telephones and kitchen and all the advertising.
Meant to be appealing and colorful and rather than just functional looking. Well, do you think that's positive?
I think it's interesting.
Yeah. It's probably a double-edged thing because on the one hand, well, better it looks pretty than, and you can Windex it than. Anyway, oh, that's so interesting. What was it called again, the exhibit?
Mechanical brides.
Mechanical Brides. Oh, that's interesting.
I'm so fascinated by the story of your parents and how they created careers out of the typewriter. It's like today the social media influencer. It's like creating a career, to fit the time. And it's interesting, I went to college and I went to a place where I had to do a very long paper to get out of this college. I love the college. And I had to type a 50-page paper on an IBM Selectric on carbon paper. And when you use carbon paper, you could use the corrector. And I think about that, excuse me, all the time. I was on the jitney coming back out here on Wednesday night, and there was a young gal, probably 30 years younger than I am. And she's just clicking away on this laptop. No sound, nothing. And I'm thinking, oh my God. And the other thing is, because I still think like I use a typewriter. When I use a computer, I still think it's a typewriter.
You're still putting white out on the screen.
I use whiteout. It's interesting. But,
Oh my God.
It's such a different time. I also use payphones in New York City, and I walked around with quarters in my pocket and listened to people on answering machines would be another. How answering machines at home. To listen to messages. So this has just opened up like my mind to this, and so I'm watching this gal, and it's just fascinating to me because it's almost like your dad learning Latin. We had to learn typing, and I sucked at it, and I still look at the keys when I use my computer because I never memorized the keys, and so it just brought up all of that. And it's such of a time,
Yeah.
And I
Embracing
love that this is
technology.
here because I love remembering times like that.
Mm.
I love remembering being 16 and having to take the typing class and sucking at it.
Well, I
As a
think this
straight-
exhibit is doing that for people. Last night I heard people say, oh, I had one of those, and my mother had one of those.
Right.
So it's that memory thing, I think, is part of
And
it.
the IBM Selectric that I had was passed down from my older siblings we all took it to college. And I just thought, gosh, I wonder where that is, because I don't even know who has it and where it went to. So this is amazing exhibit.
Oh, I thought for a minute you were going to say, maybe I can sell it to Tom Hanks. Because somebody said that to me last night. So I have this typewriter, and she showed me the picture, and she said, would Tom Hanks buy it? And I said, you might take receipt of it if you...
Brett, and then now we have one more to have it. So there's up here, and then we have that one. That's it for us.
First, I want to know, did Aunt Phyllis type it
No, no.
So how did she know if she was making a mistake?
I think she probably had to have her work checked. But I don't think back then, if you touch typed and you got a job touch typing, you made mistakes once every 3 weeks. You know, you were that's my hunch anyway. But yeah, I mean, you're supposed to touch type and never look at the, yeah.
And my second question is, did your parents see your career? Did they live to see your career?
I used to tell them things I was up to, and they were sort of, they were interested and slightly baffled a lot of the time, but they were also, my dad's theory about child rearing, because he'd had such a strange childhood himself, was I'd say, hey, look, I'm blah, 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 and I'd be like, good for you. You know, like, they weren't living vicariously through us. So, like, I always felt very free to screw up and try things because they were sort of quite removed from it. I think now is better. Parents are more involved. I think that's a positive thing. But it was also positive not to have them involved. And
They made you fearless.
yes, a confident misfit.
You had a last question over there, Lisa.
Good question. Did any of your mother's typewriters survive?
I don't know what happened to it. I remember there was one particular gigantic black one. I think she dragged it down to a junk shop when she moved house, so something like that. But so the answer is no. But it would have been nice to have that.
Thank you. Simon, you've written for people a memoir, right? Correct? You've written a memoir.
Yes.
I have not read it, which I will amend after today, but did it include your parents? Or as much the backstory you gave us today that was so beautiful?
Yeah. I wrote a column for the New York Observer. I think it was about turning 50 or 40 or something. And it was about how the things I remember most clearly are the most jarring, horrible things. So it was a playful column about the most jarring, horrible things I remember from my life. And some publisher called me up and said, oh, we should do this as a book. And it was called, and the book, it was Simon & Schuster, was originally called Nasty. And then this guy, this is a great story. Like, people drag things to Hollywood and take them around and nothing ever happens. Out of the blue, this guy called me up, John Plowman. He produced Little Britain, Ab Fab, every big hit comedy show in England. And he said, I just read your book and I want to make it into a fun TV show. And they called it Beautiful People, because that's one of the themes of the early part of the book, is like, who are the beautiful people? Are they these lunatics that you're growing up with, or are they blah, blah, blah? And the answer, of course, is yes, they are the people you grow up with. So, beautiful people, and that's what the memoir is called.
Nigel Slater's Toast. Have you read Nigel Slater's Toast?
No.
Because you and David Sedaris and Nigel Slater, there's a beautiful story, similarity there. And that's just my last note.
Well, thank you, darling. Nigel Slater's Toast. The TV show, I think it's streaming somewhere or other, but they updated it to the 90s. They updated it to the 90s because the people reading my book, the guy writing the screenplay, he said, this is so squalid and terrifying, no one will ever believe it. So they updated it to the 90s so and it's a very playful, campy TV series. It got 3 series. Olivia Colman plays my mom in it. Brenda Blethyn plays my grandmother. They had all-star people in it, and it was on. It did play here on some channel. It was in the early noughts, I think.
Is this still called Beautiful People?
Yeah, it's very, very sort of playful and doesn't sort of, they used my book as a springboard into a comedic universe. So I'm just telling you that in advance. So maybe read the book first. It's good, it's fun, but it's completely different.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks.